Francis Levy. Ed Nersessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center. And welcome to Literacy and Imagination. So before we begin this afternoon's panel, I wanted to call your attention to the show which is currently just gone up called Typographica. It was curated by Hallie Cohn and Adam Ludwig. Hallie is the curator, generally the curator of the gallery, and is the head of the art department at Marymount Manhattan College. And this was attended upon yesterday's Roundtable on typography, and it deals with the evolution of the beauty and evolution of typographic forms from calligraphy onwards. So take a, these are by Elaine Lustig Cohen, and she her husband was a famous typographer about which the moderator of yesterday's panel, Steve Heller, is writing a book. So that was the sort of subtext of that. Philoctetes programming continues to be simulcast, so that if you're at home, you can watch it, and all programs are recorded, and you simply go to past programming on our site, and you can see any Philoctetes program. So this, in 3 days, this program will be up. So I am now pleased to introduce Robert Logan. Robert Logan is Professor Emeritus in Physics at the University of Toronto, and you're probably all going to wonder why a professor of physics is moderating a panel on literacy, and maybe he'll tell us. His books include The Extended Mind, The Emergence of Language, The Human Mind and Culture, The Alphabet Effect, and The Sixth Language, Learning a Living in the Internet Age. His Understanding New Media, Extending Marshall McLuhan, is forthcoming in 2009. He's working on a project to design a smart book which combines the traditional codex book with the e-book. Dr. Logan will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests.
Dr. Logan is Bob Logan. Apologies to the people behind me, but I do have eyes in the back of my head. And now I'm going to introduce these lovely people. Lance Strate I really know for years now. He's brilliant, and he's going to tell you about himself reluctantly. He doesn't like talking about himself, but I'll tell you, he's a genius. I only met Bambi 10 minutes ago. I like her already. And I do remember that she's a linguistic anthropologist. She's been to New Guinea. She knows about birds of paradise, and she'll tell you about herself. Rosen, Jonathan, is a Capitol Fellow, lives in New York, across the park. By the way, I'm the only one not from New York. Jonathan is a writer. He wrote for the Forward, English edition, and he's a great scholar, and he'll tell you more about himself. So, Lance.
I tried to explain to Bob that the point of being a moderator was to actually introduce the panel rather than have them introduce themselves, but what can you do? Hello. I'm a professor of communication and media studies at Fordham. Mostly, I spend most of my time up in the Bronx. Maybe you've been up to that borough. And I'm also the president of the Media Ecology Association. I helped to found that organization, which Bob has had a long association with. This year I also, or actually last year, I keep forgetting we're in a new year, last year I became the executive director of the Institute of General Semantics, which it's a whole different kind of ball game, but interested in language and its relationship, and in a way interested in psychological issues connected to language. I'm going to just add, because this is on a personal note, but this informs a lot of my understanding, is that I am the father of now a 13-year-old girl with moderate autism, and that's part of who I am and part of has become part of my understanding of the world and of issues concerning communication and literacy as well. Oh, and I have a book, Echoes and Reflections. You can get it on Amazon if you care to. It is about media ecology, about that field. And also I do write in that. I have something in that about the sense of self, and also bring in autism as well, in case you're interested in that.
Over to you, Bambi.
I'm Bambi Schieffelin. I'm a linguistic anthropologist. I teach at New York University. And it seems to me I've always been interested in the ways in which language is constructed as something very cultural. And I'm very interested in the ways in which the way we speak and the way we write are often collapsed or put into new arrangements with each other. I've done most of my anthropology fieldwork in Papua New Guinea. I made my first trip to New Guinea in 1967, and I've made 5 trips after that point. I've done a dictionary of the language. I've written several books about language and children. And I've been working on a long-term project about what happens when fundamentalist Christianity is introduced into a community that has not had much contact with any Western ideologies, and literacy is part of that introduction. So I'm interested in what happens when certain kinds of ideological technologies, such as literacy, come into a place. And that interest has also encouraged me to look at analogous situations outside of New Guinea. I've worked on instant messaging among adolescents. I'm very interested in it as an invented language, as a way in which language becomes a form of play, how language like instant messaging is really part of making a speech community. So I'm interested in a number of different dimensions of language, and when language also becomes contested. It's interesting to me that instant messaging has been accused of ruining the English language, but lots of things are accused of ruining the English language. Lots of things are accused of ruining language in general. I've also studied the orthographic debates in Haiti. Haiti had 11 different orthographies in a relatively short period of time, and a lot of that has to do with how do people want their alphabets to look, and what does it say about who they are? So I'm interested in the way in which these forms of representations are really representations about who we are as well as how we think.
Thanks, Bambi. You can't ruin a language. You can just enrich it.
I agree.
Jonathan.
I'm Jonathan Rosen. I'm a writer. I've published 2 novels, 2 works of nonfiction. Bob called me a scholar. I'm not a scholar at all of anything.
You will
just
be
a writer.
today.
No, but writer, you know.
But you're a gentleman.
I'm a gentleman. I did I created the culture section of the Forward newspaper, which I left in 2000, and which might be relevant, it occurs to me, since that was really an attempt to take a 100-year-old Yiddish newspaper and reinvent it in English, and whether that was an extension of the original purposes of that newspaper, or whether it was the ultimate betrayal and represented the death of that earlier cultural institution, is one of the paradoxes that I think is bound up with questions of what it means to be culturally literate. I edit a series of books called Jewish Encounters, where I get writers to write short books on Jewish subjects by non-scholars. Rebecca Goldstein, who you heard will be here talking about Spinoza, wrote a book for my series, Betraying Spinoza, which I edited. And Peter Cole, who you heard is going to be on the translation panel, is writing a book about the Cairo Geniza. And in a way, the premise of the book is to really take non-scholars and have them have an encounter with something which customarily you really needed to be a scholar of in order to understand. And so I think mediating between those worlds is something that I'm very interested in. My editor, Jonathan Galassi, is also on your panel. I had never been to this place or even heard of it a few weeks ago, but now I feel like my entire life is contained inside the walls of it.
Parents are coming next week.
Well, that'll be impressive since my father's dead, but that too is a form of communication. I suspect that the reason I'm here initially is because I wrote a book called The Talmud and the Internet, which is subtitled A Journey Between Worlds, and that is in some sense an attempt to reconcile the sort of world of ancient religious impulses represented by the Talmud and the world of modern technological secular impulses represented by the Internet, the way in which they're different, but the surprising way in which they are actually quite similar in many ways. On a page of Talmud, nothing is whole in itself. Everything is a kind of doorway or a hyperlink that leads you to something else. And Jews have been accommodating themselves to that kind of brokenness for a very long time. The thing that seems like a unified book turns out actually to have been born out of destruction. And even the Bible itself was before it was the Bible, a series of oral works, and was brought into real codification after the destruction of the first temple. And so living between those worlds is something that interests me very much. My last book is about bird watching, and I'll end just by saying, although it wouldn't have occurred to me that that would necessarily apply, one of the things about bird watching that interests me so much is that it's a very bookish pursuit. On the one hand, you literally need a guidebook when you go out to look at birds, and you're a little too bookish. You're constantly trying to draw these wild animals into this world of 18th century nomenclature and rigorous scientific identification, and you're looking them up in a book. But at the same time, the birds are sort of leading you out into the wild world and into a world that lives beyond language. And I suppose because I'm a writer and sort of look at the world, I suppose, like a novelist, there's that sense that words can do everything and simultaneously the realization that they do absolutely nothing. And the way that one lives between those twin impulses, between the thing itself and the attempt to articulate it, is probably bound up with a lot of the things I do, though it hasn't been a conscious project.
Thank you. I just want to mention a couple of things that was not mentioned about me. I was born in Brooklyn, and I've been a dancer, studied with Merce Cunningham, also a bird watcher.
Merce Cunningham is a bird watcher?
Yeah. Now, I was told that we can't give lectures, but I thought I would inject a couple of pieces of information. The word lecture, by the way, is very pertinent because in French, lecteur means a reader. And the reason that professors are called lecturers is that before there was a printing press, in order for the students to have a book, the professor would read their book to the students, and the students would write it down. And that was called the first reading. The second reading, the professor read the book a second time, and the second time he read the book, the students made sure that they copied the book correctly. And then there was a third reading. The third reading was they would actually discuss the ideas. And in the country that I now live in, Canada, in our parliament, every bill has a first reading, a second reading, and a third reading. And they probably don't know why. By the way, congratulations that you elected such a wonderful man. You made Canada totally happy. By the way, Obama carried Canada like 90%. Okay. So a few facts. We only began to speak probably about 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. There are some linguists that will claim that we spoke 2 million years ago, and that school of thought actually admits that at first the language that we had was called a proto-language. A fellow by Derek Bickerton came up with that term, and it just meant that we had single words. We didn't actually construct sentences, but grammatical speech is probably only about 100,000 years old. About 30,000 years ago, there was this explosion of technology among hominids, probably humans, in which we first became human, and all of a sudden there was symbolic representation. So literacy, I don't want you to take the term literally. Literacy is about symbolic representation, and therefore it includes art and topography and dance. And so we will talk about all kinds of literacy, and I think that my colleagues are in agreement with that. You're never in agreement with anybody. But how do you feel about that?
No, we're both.
Oh, co-director. Oh, excuse me. Okay.
Oh, thank you for interrupting. Because I forgot to mention, please feel free to interrupt because non-scholars are cool now, right? According to Jonathan. So please feel free to interject at any moment.
Maybe they are scholars.
I don't know why you only publish non-scholars in your series. Can a scholar publish a book in your series?
Yes, as long as he's not writing or she's not writing about the thing of which they are a scholar. Although Rebecca Goldstein has a PhD in philosophy, so it wasn't really a departure for her. But she's also a novelist.
So a physics professor can talk about the Bible.
Of course.
Cool.
So what was it you were going to say?
I think I would probably not make literacy everything. I'm very happy to talk about things being, part of a system of symbolic representation, but I probably wouldn't put in dance. I probably would like to keep it focused to just a certain subset of forms of symbolic representation having to do specifically with language. Because I think if it becomes everything, then we lose a little bit of focus. So I'm probably going to side. I don't know what Lance thinks. But.
Well, I've been on a number of sessions about media literacy where I've said this is a terrible term to be using. And, the primary problem being that it's, it obfuscates the difference between literacy, which is, knowing your letters, literally means knowing your letters, and to talk about movie and TV viewing as a literacy is to say that it's all the same. And actually in many of our fields, you find that kind of language going on, so that everything is a text, right? A film is a text, and you have a reading of it. The way somebody dresses is a text, and you read that. And it's a metaphor. It takes you to a certain place, but in the end, it just completely lose the very important distinctions between writing as a technology, the written word, and the spoken word, which I'd never use the term literacy, speech literacy, oral literacy. It sounds absurd. Or visual literacy, again, it just doesn't. I think it's a bad practice to do that. And most people who talk about media literacy, what they really mean is media education, which is fine. And as Bob well knows, Marshall McLuhan and Edmund Carpenter, way back when, they talked about media as languages, which I find much more acceptable. Well, maybe we should be saying media fluency then, but that's my objection to that.
Let's use our imagination. By tying these things together, we learn some interesting things. My tie is an example. Print. This tie is an example of print.
Can you turn around?
Oh, yeah. You like it? Now, the first people to do print were the Chinese, printing on silk. And their printing press then led to them printing words on paper. And that idea took a long time to come to the West, but it finally did. And a fellow by the name of Janssens Koster in Holland started making print of paper, words on paper. And then Gutenberg amplified that by actually using movable type. You see, when you do a print like this, you carve out the design that you want, and then you stamp it on the material. They used to carve out the text in reverse and print it on the paper. So there's a big connection between cravat literacy and the literacy that you'd like to study as scholars.
Okay.
Moving on, 30,000 years ago was the beginning of symbolic representation and the very first actual notations. So literacy is about notation, correct?
Well, it depends how literal you take it. Literally it means letters. So, technically, Chinese writing would not fall under the category of literacy because it has characters but not letters. But mostly, generally that's widened to include all writing systems. So I think, notation I think would be fair game.
All right. Well, it began 30,000 years ago. And it was little marks made on bones to keep track of things. And 10,000 years ago, they began to make little clay tokens that our friend Denise Montbesserat discovered in grave sites all over the Middle East. And these clay tokens represented commodities. They were the receipts for tributes that the farmers gave to the priests. And the reason they gave these tributes to the priests was so that they could redistribute the agricultural commodities to the irrigation workers, which is how their system worked, because you have to have irrigation in the Middle East in order to do farming. These clay tokens were then pushed into clay envelopes. They used to put the tokens inside of clay envelopes, and then they started pressing the tokens into the clay envelopes, and that was the beginning of writing. And it started to evolve, and the first kinds of writings were hieroglyphic, that is pictorial, and after that, instead of just using pictures, people began to use the sounds that the words made to represent more than one thing, because there are some words that you have two words that have the same sound, and so the pictures began to represent sounds, and pretty soon we developed an alphabet in which the letters are meaningless and they represent just sounds. And that's what you would call literacy.
In its most precise sense. Yeah.
Yes, very precise. And that began in the South Sinai Desert about, I wrote this down because I can't remember everything, that's about 3,700 years old. And the printing press is only 550 years old, computing 60 years old, and the public internet 15 years old. So there are some of the facts about literacy.
Great.
Yeah. Well.
Well, I think it's actually a fascinating process, and it kind of shows you the way the mind works. It is that we begin with very concrete things, like little tokens that are actually, in some ways resemble what they're representing, and we get more and more abstract as time goes on. So it starts three-dimensionally. It's a wonderful process. It's almost like a Monty Python routine where it takes them centuries to figure out, all right, we're going to, it's the accountants. The accountants invented writing because they're keeping track of the stuff in the palace. And it's like, all right, we're going to take these tokens, and they get loose. You lose them, so let's put them in this container and seal it up so we don't lose them. But the problem is then when you want to know what you have, you got to break it open and count them again. So they figure, well, before we put them in, let's push them, impress them on the outside, and then put them in, and then we will know what's in there. And it's like centuries later, some genius comes along and says, we really don't have to put them in anymore because we're just pressing them in, and then we can just flatten it all out. I mean, that takes like another century to realize we can just use a flat clay surface, and we don't even have to use the tokens at all. We can just make the shapes of the tokens, and voila, we have writing. And we start out with writing as just being one symbol for one word, which is unwieldy. It's results in thousands and thousands of characters that you have to know, which is very difficult to learn, which is why, and the only reason the Chinese still maintain that is that there is no one Chinese language. There are many mutually unintelligible spoken languages that are represented universally by the Chinese characters, just as numbers are not pronounced, the number, 2 can be pronounced as 2 or de or dos, it doesn't matter. But to simplify the system, and to account for even more terms, they start to use phonetic characters that have less and less meaning until we ultimately get to the alphabet as a phonetic system. You can see it, the letter A, if you turn it upside down, it looks like a little ox. And that's the original word was, the original A, the original symbol was the ox. Then it got turned on its side, and in the Semitic writing, like aleph means ox. It actually means ox. And then when it crosses the Mediterranean to the Greeks, they call it alpha, which has no meaning, but it still bears that. And they call their writing Phoenician writing, where we get phonetic writing from. And then when we get to the Latin alphabet, it just becomes A. We finally simplify it and lose the idea that it has a name, and which suggested that it had a further meaning beyond simply just a sound. So real alphabet reduces it all to sound and gets rid of all that excess baggage. Very abstract.
So let's talk about imagination now. How did imagination come about? How did the civil servant figure out, hey, we don't need an envelope anymore? Audience? Anyone with imagination in the room?
But what is imagination?
Oh, it's a good question.
I wanted to ask Bonnie,
Bambi.
Bambi, before when you were talking about orthography, because you were pointing to sort of more a utilitarian kind of notion, which deriving out of kind of quotidian activities in accountancy. But in the orthographic kind of conceptualization, there seems to be another motivation besides simply that the kind of almost Darwinian survivalist idea, and that the notion of language would derive out of what we sometimes talk about as emotions that perhaps that tie animals and men together, but not necessarily in the cerebral cortex. That somehow language derives out of the structure of the brain, which strives towards certain types of representations that may derive from emotional elements that are not so simple as survivalist elements. I mean, I know, when you said that orthographically, it sort of struck me as being a very interesting type of idea.
Well, I think on the one hand, I think there's this notion that these letters, I mean, they have a history, but the history can get lost. And so there can be a kind of arbitrariness to the way in which a particular grapheme comes to stand for sounds. I mean, and people, what I found really interesting is the kind of etymology here, and people also make up etymologies all the time. They say, oh, well, this looks like this, it looks like the thing, therefore it must have a etymological or historical relationship to the thing, but it doesn't always. But people are very happy to have an explanation.
It does with the alphabet, though, because every alphabet was derived from the South Sinai alphabet. The only exception is the Korean alphabet, which was invented around 1500s because the king wanted the people to have more literacy, and they invented an alphabet. But the order of the letters is the same in all alphabets.
There's a question over there.
Oh, good.
If I heard correctly, these first tokens had to do with commerce,
Yes.
the medium of exchange.
Yeah.
Correct.
To put this all into
Agriculture.
financial.
A bushel of wheat, a cow.
We had a need to trade, to barter, to have.
Well, it wasn't
financial
trading and bartering. The economic system in Mesopotamia was you had two kinds of workers, farmers, and irrigation workers. The people that grew the food had to give some of their food to the people that dug the canals. And so the people, then a third group came around, which were the administrators, the priests, the accountants, the civil servants, the middlemen, the people we hate. I hope you're not an accountant, sir. Anyway, the thing is, there had to be a system of people collecting food from the people that grew it and redistributing it to the irrigation workers. And to keep track of who paid their taxes, the token system arose. So it was a tax system. So writing was invented by accountants.
But Bob, can I?
Jonathan,
Yeah.
I want to say something. I'm not sure how it relates, but maybe it's a question for you two. I'm not sure. I feel like when you were talking about how the origins, the physical origins of the language sort of dissolve. You don't remember the ox anymore. Although I was talking once to Art Spiegelman, who's this great cartoonist, who gave me a whole lecture about the ox and the olive, and he really thinks that's the invention of cartoons, which are Jewish, because he's returning it to its pictographic form. But that's not really what I want to ask about. It seems to me that there's a way in which the Judeo-Christian myth about language it made something of language that was sacred in its abstraction and therefore divine. And whether it's John saying in the beginning was the Word, or whether it's simply the biblical notion that God spoke and made the world.
Yes.
And I feel that one of the impulses behind my writing The Talmud and the Internet was an essay by Gertrude Himmelfarb, who was complaining about the Internet. She's a Victorian scholar, very, very fine historian. She was saying that when she looks up books on the Internet, all sorts of unbidden things bump their way into her consciousness, and she doesn't like it. And then she said the Bible was a book meant to be held in your hand. And in a sense, it was thinking about how the Bible wasn't initially a book meant to be held in your hand that led me to think about what preceded it. And I guess my question is this, that the reason why I don't think a printed tie, for example, would fit my definition of literacy, as you said, is because we have made of language in its religious understanding is part of the organic world, that the world itself, the Jewish mystics believed, is actually made up of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And so I feel there's a contemporary anxiety now that's like a post-internet anxiety that has to do with the sense that, in a sense, language was like a gold-backed dollar, and the Bible was the gold backing the dollar. And that there's something now about losing that ultimate point of religious reference, and language is now breaking apart in ways. And are we returning to interesting oral elements of the culture that are equally religious? Is religion not an element of it? But for me, I feel there's a religious component, and so in this awkward way, I'm gesturing towards a question for both of you. Unless it makes no sense at all, in which case maybe someone from the audience will say
But do you want to?
Well, having worked in a place where there was no, in Papua New Guinea, in the community in which I worked, there was no religion based on a book. There was no religion, there was no system that had language, special language that went with it.
Right.
So I think, that it's kind of the luck of the draw whether you're getting one of these systems that's very tied to
Well, I was
language.
speaking of Judeo-Christian language. and
Okay,
culture.
so that system has its own idea of language, and also, writing and translation, and which text can you actually, if you add Islam, you get into another theory of language, another ideology of writing and language, and when you can actually change the words, when you can't change the words. If you think about all of the debates just with the Christian Bible about varieties of saying those words. I worked in Papua New Guinea. They used a variety of the Bible for translation called the Good News Bible. It's a very simplified Bible, but it's the basis for translating into the Talk Peace in Bible, which became the basis for translating into all the vernaculars. So this question of what the word is already really up for grabs, and it becomes a very fluid thing in and of itself. And so I think you're really getting back to the kind of ideology of language, and whether it is the word itself, is it the way you write the word? For some people, is it the way you spell the word? Look what happens when you represent America with a K instead of a C. So I think these ideas of these letters, they can have all this other meaning that kind of come in, is something that's very cultural. It's very changeable, and it all depends on what values you happen to put on those letters. K gets people into a lot of trouble.
Kafka called his book, wasn't it with a K spelling?
Yes, yeah.
Jonathan,
I've got something to say, though, about that. And, on the myth or the sacredness of writing, every culture that I know of that has writing initially develops a story that connects it to something sacred, so that the Greek myth is of King Cadmus sowing the dragon's teeth, and he was the Phoenician king who brought in writing, so it has a mythological origin. And you're right, the Jewish origin is that God creates the world with all the letters, which also helps to explain the madness of Derrida. He was drawing on that kind of stuff. So he says writing existed before speech, which isn't.
Although I don't think Judaism should be entirely blamed for
No,
deconstruction.
I don't. I blame
50%.
Derrida for Derrida.
Was Derrida Jewish?
Yes, absolutely.
he's
But France
Jewish.
is responsible
Absolutely
for the other
Jewish.
half.
Yeah, Derrida's Jewish.
I'm just
Was
Jewish. I'm not absolutely Jewish.
But I've actually been doing some work on religion and orality and literacy and media, and I actually have taken a position that I think it's arguable, a lot of people wouldn't, but that there is no such thing as religion before writing.
Oh, okay. I'm going to jump in as
Well, let me
moderator.
just present that.
Go ahead, dig the hole
position.
deeper. Go ahead.
Sure. That there is, of course, notions of the sacred, of the spiritual. There are rituals and all of that. And actually, another anthropologist, Jack Goody, has written about that. What people, before writing, you have some kind of belief system, of course, and there's a tendency to see all the world as imbued with spirit, as having a supernatural quality, and you do what is part of your tradition. It's mixed in with the whole of culture. It's not a separate sphere that's called religion. And then if you happen to go to some other group of people, you do what they do, right? You don't, it's not an either-or situation. But when writing comes in, that's when people start to say, here's the text, here's the truth. It's either this way or the highway, right? And we start to create the dividing line. I mean, it starts in Judaism, it becomes, I'll use the Islamic way to put it because it's so eloquent. There is no God but God, right? I mean, which is, hear, O Israel, the Lord is the God, Yahweh is God, God is, that's it. God is one, only one. And then Christianity, sort of ratchets it up by saying there's only one religion, only one way to God. It's either this way or nothing, all or nothing. And that's either or, convert or be a heathen. That is what religion is about. It's about the sacred text. And the root word of religion, it's a Latin word, something like religare. It's some ambiguity about what it means. But one of the meanings, I believe, is to reread.
Relegate.
Well, binding is what most people point to it, but there is a meaning that's in dispute that means to reread, and you can sort of see this as, approaching a ceremony through reading and through rereading rather than, lacking a sacred text or a kind of sacred prayer book.
Thank you, Lance.
Okay.
Now my turn.
Yes.
This is going to.
We're not going to have any questions until the panelists.
I'll get
It was
back.
when we thought we had nothing to say.
No, we usually do it in about an hour and 15 minutes. So let's keep that.
This is going to be offensive to the Jewish writers in the room that think
We're waiting.
that religion started with writing.
Excuse me, but I don't think that religion started with
All
writing.
right, well, he did.
So it's offensive to me.
It's hero Israel, not
Remember,
write this down.
there was a fellow named Abraham, and he lived in Chaldee, the city of the Ur, or the city of the Chaldees. And his father was an icon maker. And he was a sort of rebellious kind of guy. And he left his father, he left his family, and he went schlepping through the desert, carrying his God with him. And there was no writing. If you analyze the Bible carefully...
Of course there was, Bob.
No, there was... Excuse me, let me...
You just said there was writing.
You wouldn't let me interrupt you, I won't let you
Okay.
interrupt me. There was no writing until the time of Moses. If you read the Bible carefully, you will see that there's no mention of writing anywhere. How does Abraham make a deal? He puts his hand under someone's thigh. When he buys the grave place for Sarah, he brings out his people, he brings out the people he's buying from. He gets them all together and he says, here are so many minas of silver for the grave plot. No written contract because they didn't have writing. Rachel puts a god under her saddlebag when she's leaving, right? And gets into trouble. The first Jews were not that monotheistic. They were more monotheistic than the people they were around, but they certainly had no writing. There's no mention of writing. There's no use of the metaphor of the book or of writing until you get to Moses. In my book called The Alphabet Effect, I make this point, that Moses, where does he learn about writing? He sits with Jethro in the South Sinai. Jethro's people are called the Kenites. Kenites means the coppersmiths, the copper miners. They're the people that invented the alphabet. The first alphabet was found in the copper mines. How did they get an alphabet? The Egyptians had a 22-consonant system, a phonetic system. They used hieroglyphics called sacred writing. So that's where you get the concept of the sacred in the writing. And the 22 uniconsonant letters were used to spell out the names of foreign dignitaries that would come to visit. So when Moshe Dayan went to Egypt, they used the 22 uniconsonantal signs to spell out his name. The coppersmiths asked the Egyptians, hey, we like this writing thing. Can we teach us how to do it? You want to learn sacred writing? We can't teach you that. Use 22 uniconsonantal signs. They did. That was the beginning of the first phonetic alphabet. Moses goes down to live with Jethro. He learns, I believe, writing from Jethro. He learns a number of things from Jethro. He learns how to organize activities, pick captains of 10, over 10. So the first writing mentioned in the Bible is always associated with Moses. When Moses goes to Mount Sinai, not the hospital, comes down from Mount Sinai with the tablets written with the finger of God. First time writing is ever mentioned is with Moses. So, in my opinion, and by the way, the first time God is called Yahweh is when Moses gives him that name. Before that, he's Elohim. Elohim is the plural of El. El was the chief god of Canaan. Now, what is Yahweh? Well, there's a saying in the Bible that's translated very poorly into English is, I am that I am, which is Yahweh Asher Yahweh. And it actually, according to some Hebrew scholars, not me, but some scholars, it means that which brings things into being, which relates to the story of how God said, let there be light, and there was light. So in my humble opinion, the true monotheism begins with Moses. It's the same time that writing first emerges. And I believe you can have religion before you have writing.
Can I just,
Go, please.
I mean,
I
you're
want to say something.
actually, Bob, in your book,
You've read it,
which, yeah, I
so you should
and
know
I
better
was
than what
the
you told
editor
these
for
people.
for the revision. No, but it's the alphabet that your argument is that the alphabet was introduced at the same time as the, at Sinai, the Hebrew alphabet.
To the
But-
Hebrews.
Right, but writing was in Mesopotamia at the time that
Abraham left, yeah.
yeah. So, and writing is not something new at that point. And that's holding aside the fact that that whole story is something
whole
that
written story.
Well, we can't really take literally. I mean, at least if you look at it from a scholarly
You can't
point of
take
view,
something that's written literally?
it's not
How else do you take
history.
it? How else do you take it?
Interpretively, it's not.
Scholarly games. Go
It's
ahead.
not. It's not a historical document, and so it can understand that
It
there's.
is an historic document. It's the first history of a people where they told the truth.
It's not. It doesn't stand up though to historical fact, and most people believe that. That's I mean, we have to kind of look at it with a grain of salt. And the story about Abraham or Abram shattering the idols isn't actually in the Torah, and it was something that was added later as an interpretation to try to make the connection. So I'm not. I'm not trying to debate the fact that it's in the story of Moses and the Exodus that we see the introduction of the alphabet, but writing itself precedes the Bible, and in fact, it's where the written story of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia includes a story of the flood, which is believed to be the origin or feed into the story of Noah as it was revised and included into the
But you
Bible.
don't address my main point, which is there's never a talk of writing until you get to Moses.
Just because there's no talk of it, and you bring up points, and the fact that you introduce writing, as I think you could certainly substantiate, you don't get rid of everything else. Like, we still talk.
Well, can I say something?
To
When you're
this
done.
day.
Yeah, sure,
But,
say something.
and so, I mean, a lot of everything that works before is still there. People are still going to swear oaths. People still, to this day, give oral testimony at trials. In fact, in some courts,
With their hand on the Bible?
yeah, but in some courts, you're not allowed to read. They don't let juries read the transcripts, but they have them read to them. oral residue, I mean, remains there, and in the initial impact of writing, I mean, it feeds into areas where it's needed, and it doesn't replace things that are working until later on. I mean, isn't that the case?
Jonathan's turn.
Well, I mean,
Yeah, Jonathan's trying to jump in there.
I just want to say one thing. Is that
Yeah, go.
in the rabbinic spirit? I think you're both right, and that's important, because not to make this about the Jewish mode of thinking, but the rabbis, the first century and before, the story they told is that Moses received the entire written law, and he simultaneously had whispered in his ear the entire oral law. And so the message that actually contains is that the written law, and they're both considered Torah, they're both considered the Word of God in this mysterious paradoxical fashion, so that the arguments that later rabbis have, although they're clearly being invented before our eyes, nevertheless have the stature of something revealed at Sinai. It's a paradox that's very difficult for a lot of people to comprehend, because it seems so clearly man-made, and yet somehow that's the nature, the power of the culture, is that within the culture, these conversations, attempting to reconcile conversations with a text that was seen as divine, were a kind of oral accompaniment. It's like having the Constitution and all the debates about the Constitution that lead to laws. One of the things that Christianity did is strip Judaism of people. It did not allow people to understand that was the nature of Judaism. It was suddenly seen as having the Old Testament. Jews actually had a New Testament, which we call the Talmud. And the Talmud itself was not even meant to be written down. It was only written down after the Second Temple was destroyed. It was meant to be the flexible, fluid, conversational, internet-like accompaniment that lives alongside of the written law. And the two together constitute Torah. So there is this notion of the written and the oral both. And I think that is actually really important, partly because Judaism was robbed of that understanding, and partly because it created a monolithic understanding of fundamentalism. I mean, simultaneous with the Darwinian revolution that robbed us of Eden as an actual place was 19th century philological discoveries that the Bible was actually written by people. Those two things went side by side. And when, Gertrude Himmelfarb, of course, knows all about the origin of the Bible and the origin of human beings, but this fantasy that the Bible was something meant to be held in your hand that was born fully formed, it's like the idea that Adam and Eve exist wholly made without an evolutionary history. And I think, since you asked about imagination, that a lot of this debate has to do with literature itself. In the aftermath of Darwin, does the universe have an author? Does it have a plot? Is it moving towards a conclusion? And these questions are harder to answer if you only live in the Old Testament notion. Whereas if you already received the inoculation against brokenness and imperfectness and live inside a culture where human modification is simultaneously divine, it's not so either or. The great calamity that befell 19th century Christian culture after Darwin, which is you were a person of faith and then you weren't a person of faith, is actually not the only model. And like the paradigm now between creationists and ultra-Darwinians is a foolish, false paradigm that's not unconnected to this notion that there's an Old Testament. It's the written and the oral, and I feel like that's connected to the kind of work you do, which is seeing all of these spontaneously generated elements of communication also as part of our larger world of literacy,
Jonathan,
if that makes sense.
In your book also, I think one of the points that stuck out for me was the notion of just it's simple, the precedent. And there's sort of an equation with legal precedent, because the Talmud the Talmud is the model for what we look at as in the legal system that we, in a certain way that we live in, successions of interpretations.
Right.
And is literacy somehow founded in the notion of precedent?
I don't know. But I think it's a wonderful myth, this idea that multiplicity is not the negation of meaning. The idea that everybody standing at Sinai actually heard something different. But the voice of God is always
But precedent in law is the oral system, whereas in the French, that's the British system we inherited, is to use precedent, and the French don't use precedent. And that's purely literate. That's cutting out the oral residue from the legal system.
Right.
I just wanted to highlight the oral literate, bond, because I think that there's often the assumption that if it's written, someone will read it silently. And I know, at least in many, many cultures, people only read the Bible aloud. In some places, people feel if the words don't have breath, they're dead. And so I think it's kind of always important to not take the voice out of the written text, because that's just another way to inhabit those words. So, I mean, I found in my study in Papua New Guinea, no one ever read the Bible silently. It was, people would sit by themselves when they were learning to read, and it was the first thing that they did learn to read, but they had to hear it, they had to say it, they had to really have it be oral, and there was no other way to do it. And many cultures reject literacy and reject the biblical forms of literacy because they see it as something that if it's not spoken, it's dead. And it's dangerous. It's death. The fact that it looks like death is what makes it dangerous.
That's really interesting. We're very tied to the notion of literacy here, and many of the people here who attend Philoctetes, for instance, are writers and have a huge investment, especially in the revival and of interest in classicism to a certain extent. But literacy can be looked at as a moment in the evolution of mankind in a certain sense, the kind of literacy you were talking about. And I was wondering, you've all been emphasizing the beginnings of literacy, but if you take where we're going now, has there been a kind of exponential kind of change? Like we have social networking now, we have Google now, we have enormous changes that are occurring within a relatively short spaces of time. I mean, we go back to the biblical age, then we go 2,000 years. There is, explosion. You have romanticism, you have classicism, you have varying forms of what we now know to be literacy. But is literacy itself a notion that is, it's something that's sacred to me, but one of the reasons for this panel is to throw it up in a kind of evolutionary context and look at it as, because now we have so many other modalities, and what you're talking about. I mean, the oral was the previous modality, but where are we going in terms of what will be the successors?
Well, one of the things that killed reading out loud was the printing press. Before the printing press, you had to read out loud to be able to read the damn thing.
It's like
sheet music.
handwritten.
What?
It was like sheet music. You had to play it yourself.
Yeah, and your remark about you have to give breath to words, well, it happens every Saturday morning. People have to read the Torah out loud.
But also people are listening to selected shorts. I mean, there's still a tremendous appreciation for the living word, and I think that when you look at the innovation that's going on with internet styles of communication, whether it's instant messaging or all of these other forms, people are mixing words, they're mixing numbers. I mean, they're using the sounds. That's one of the things that's so interesting about the advances of people using the inventive capacity. And that's where I think the imagination really, for me, gets pulled right in.
Well, Marshall McLuhan, who taught at Lance's School of Fordham and at my university, and the man that I worked with and collaborated with, said that with electric inflow of information, that there's a reversal back to the oral tradition. And so the forms of literacy that you find on the internet are very oral. And that's why literate people, snobby literate people, will say that they're ruining the language with this instant messaging and all the rest. But my students are so gorgeous. I mean, the way they teach me this new language, I love it. It's just another
It's another
dimension.
Repertoire.
It's another
variety.
repertoire. And it's only the fuddy-duddies that think that the language is being ruined by these young kids. They're just enriching our language.
Well, I think it has to do with what we think of as language, and whether we're taking the view that there is only one and it's what's found in dictionaries and grammars, or whether we really see it as a living thing.
That's right. And language is not sacred. It's profane.
Well,
I agree that the connection between language and the sacred, but people that treat language as something sacred kill it.
That's the prescriptive grammarians
Prescriptivist, right.
who came in with the printing press, when you can just say, this is it, right? You can make before the printing press, you could walk 10 miles in England and people couldn't understand each other. Now, once you get the printing press and you get schooling by the book, you create homogeneous languages, and then you also set up a hard and fast border so that German becomes a different language from Dutch, and you no longer have the gradual shading of dialects. But when you say the reversal, and it was a very interesting, I mean, McLuhan had lots of insights, but didn't always work them out quite right. And I think actually, in a psychoanalytic term, is better used here, the return of the repressed, that as literacy became more and more dominant, it repressed a lot of features of orality, of oral culture, and electronics comes in and kind of gives a hit to literacy, which
it deserves,
allows orality, what's been repressed about orality, to return, to bubble back up. So a lot of people use the term post-literate to talk about our present situation, and I think that is the case, that we are post-literate. And it's hard to say. There's so much agitation right at this moment about newspapers. Newspapers are on their way out. That's it. Young people don't read newspapers.
I don't
read
either.
the paper every morning. Young people, they're gone. Even the New York Times is accepting advertising on the front page for the first time. It's hopeless. And I think actually tying shoes is part of this as well. I haven't pinpointed it yet, but kids don't tie shoes anymore, and I'm sure that's a literate skill. It has something to do with the focus, or I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's a mistake to think that literacy is a uniform kind of thing, which is what you've been saying. And Eric Havelock had the notion of there are many different literacies. Craft literacy was a state that we were in for a long time before the modern age, where only a select minority knew how to read and write, and everyone else was non-literate. They had orality, they had oral culture and oral tradition. And I think we're moving into a new state of that sort of thing. I think by the end of the century, it may well be that most people are not literate. People, right, you'd think there's an explosion of literacy with blogs. Everyone's blogging away. But suddenly you get video blogs, the V-blogs, and more people are doing that because it's easier, right? It's easier to just, get your little webcam and just talk. I think as we get to speech synthesis and speech recognition technologies, people are just going to spend less time. Actually, Daniel Boorstin, the former Librarian of Congress, coined a nice term for it, alliteracy. People who are literate but don't read. They choose now not to read. So we have alliteracy. I think more and more people who are just, not literate or minimally literate enough to read road signs and maybe, some instructions, but don't read literature, don't read, news reports, don't engage in the kind of literate practices
and
that
not
we've
write.
become
You think
familiar.
that people will stop writing?
Some people will stop writing. It's not going to be uniform.
Right, yeah.
We have different styles. Some people will use orality, some will use literacy, some will write the great novel on instant messaging, yet to be written.
Or those phones, those
Really
new,
yet to be written.
those new
I think
Japanese
someone that could
phone
write a
novels.
novel in
Right.
instant
But
messaging
those are pot boilers.
would be
Those
a
are
bestseller.
pot boilers, aren't they? Those
I
novels?
guess so, yeah.
Japanese,
The new Japanese novels written on just through texting.
cell phone.
But can I ask? I guess that's.
Oh, it's been done already?
Yeah.
Oh, never original.
Japanese novels written exclusively on the cell phones. I think the New York Times did a piece about 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Well, what the
about
hell is a novel but something new?
it. Yeah, that's right.
Novel.
Right.
Jonathan, what were you going to say?
It's funny. A novel is not a bad example, but the funny thing about a novel is that novelists were already rebels against a set world of knowledge. To write an epic poem, you really had to know, you'd be steeped in all sorts of forms. So novelists were already saying anybody could do it. But I guess my question is really a much more practical one, because I don't want to be one of the fuddy-duddies who denounces the new forms. In fact, the Talmud and the Internet was really intended as a kind of celebration, in a sense, to say, actually, look, it's a full world, and yet, to use a very humble example, my daughter's in 3rd grade. She goes to a school, progressive school, where they teach you how to learn. And I'm all in favor of that. But then there's that moment where you think, will she ever know the times tables? And I think it raises a question about what is a canon, or what, because there are difficult things. It doesn't have to be some Matthew Arnold notion, of the best that's been thought and written. But still, how do you transmit it then? And I don't deal with it in the way that I imagine you. I do. I think about it because of my children. But you guys are educators, and I'm wondering, all of you are. Do the people who are literate in lolcats or with the instant messaging, are they simultaneously able to read the things that require a certain kind of patience, time, and context.
Well, I taught a course last fall called The Origin of the Internet at the Origins Institute at McMaster University. And I got kids that were interested in internet, obviously. And oh my God, it's another world. It's another, like you don't have to go to Papua New Guinea. You just start.
Yeah, log on. Try lolcats.
Yeah, I mean, it's like another language, another world, another sensibility. And I was excited to be with them. I mean, I learned so much from them. I said to them, you should be teaching the course and I should be the student. And I encouraged them to speak. By the way, you had a question.
Yes, this poor man, I keep looking at this poor man raising his hand.
I've been obsessed with this topic for 30 years and it's driven me nuts. So my basic point is, I like Carl Jung, and he basically says image is everything. He says, unfortunately, it might take 600 years for the rest of the world to catch on. So, image...
Excuse me, could you come to the mic?
Okay.
I can't pick it up.
It's right here.
The mic in the back room.
He's basically, this is not working.
It's okay.
Okay.
It is. It's working there.
Basically saying image is everything. We have a dream, the collective unconscious. Image is there first. To me, a word is just a name for the image. So it's the end of the process. After everything has been perceived, processed, and all the creative work has been done, I name the outcome with a word. So it's bypassing all the creative functioning, the growth, the development. I mean, even Aristotle said 300 years ago that, it's like using language is like significance talking to significance, or an echo talking to an echo and expecting a unique answer. So all of this is that, after all the work has been done, so I'm just asking you, do you believe that the image got there first, and that a name, if there was no image, what would the word be naming? So it's like after the fact. So I just feel like this discussion is missing how creativity is getting completely left out. This is just reporting in a coherent way what I have discovered, but it's ignoring everything that makes me human and creates culture. I know I'm just dropping a lot on you, so...
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I will answer your question. The first images, remember I said 30,000 years ago they started with symbolic representation? Well, the symbolic representation was those caves full of images of animals that they were hunting. In terms of how did words come about, I have a theory about that. It's in a book called The Extended Mind. Please look it up on Google, folks. They told me I could sell books here, but I'd rather sell myself and let you buy the book on Amazon. In The Extended Mind, I come up with the following idea. Before we had words, we dealt with percepts. We didn't have concepts. And life became quite complex as we lived as hominids, because we learned how to make tools. We learned how to control fire. Once we controlled fire, we had to live in large groups to make use of that fire. We had to learn how to get along with each other. We started doing food sharing. We started doing coordinated hunting and gathering. So life became quite complex, and we needed something more than just our percepts to be able to manage our day-to-day existence. And that's why I believe we developed language. Language arose as concepts. We were able to conceptualize. Why is conceptualizing important? Because you can't plan unless you can conceptualize. You have to be able to talk about things that are not there immediately in your perceptual field. And so I believe that words arose as our concepts arose, and they were our first words. So they unite all the percepts we had that were related to each other. So the word water brought to mind water you drink, water you wash with, water you cook with, rain, rivers, lakes, etc. That, I believe, was why language emerged, because it became a survival tool. It helped us to plan, to live together, work together. We're the only animal that can plan. Now you might say, well, birds plan, they build nests, and beavers plan, they build dams, but they do that by instinct. And when conditions change, if the river stops flowing, the beaver is finished. He has to move on.
Would you say language is the agency of consciousness?
I didn't say that, but it could be. I don't know. Consciousness is a very difficult subject to talk about.
Can I talk about it?
You can certainly talk about it. You can talk about anything.
Well,
Go ahead.
I mean, this actually relates to.
I like this lady. She laughs at all my jokes.
And this relates to some of my experience dealing with autism.
Good.
Because I mean, there's an example of human beings who sometimes don't develop language at all, or develop it in a very atypical way, and often in a delayed manner. And actually, one sort of idea that had been circulating around, and I had kind of been introduced to early on in communication, was somehow there is no thought without language, that all our thinking is done in language. And that clearly is not true, because we can think in images. Perhaps the best known individual with autism is Temple Grandin, who's a professor actually of agriculture, and she describes her thought processes as being akin to a VCR, that she thinks in moving images, she can fast forward and rewind, and that language is in effect a second language to her. That is, that she has to consciously work at turning those images into words. When you deal with children with autism, I mean, one of the methods that they use for a lot of children to try to teach language is to use little pictures. That is a kind of step, that when you can learn the picture, which resembles, a picture of a glass resembles the glass, then that's like the first step to learn the word glass, which doesn't resemble the glass at all. So, I mean, and you can see the process really going back, as you said, to perception, because the normal development, one of the things we develop early on as a precursor to language is just pointing. Yes. Children with autism need to be taught this. You think about it, what does it mean to point? That when the child points, like, look at the funny man, right? But doesn't have the language, but is pointing and looking, right? So what's going on is a kind of, you see what I see. It's a kind of understanding, a nonverbal understanding of a shared consciousness. And there are Uda Frith and Simon Baron-Cohen, who, by the way, is related to Sacha Baron Cohen, and he's a leading researcher in autism, have called this theory of mind, which is the theory that other people have minds like my own. And so what goes on in their heads is akin to what goes on in my head. And they find that individuals with autism lack that theory. That they can have a perfectly valid understanding of the world, but that they do not understand. I mean, the classic example of this is you show people a scene, okay? There are two people, one person puts $1 in a box and closes it, leaves the room. The other person then takes the $1 out of the box. Then the person who wasn't in the room comes back. Now you ask the observer, where will that person who came back think the $1 is? The person with autism will say he'll think that that it's with the second person who took it. They won't make the distinction of that person who left the room having another point of view. Whereas a person with straightforward mental retardation will immediately understand that the other person will not know what I have seen and what I know. So, and a lot of this, I mean, does relate to our ability to understand and have empathy for each other. And that goes back to images as being the more primitive in a way, and it's a more basic form of thinking and communicating.
Bambi?
So I want to interject an example that speaks to the cultural nature of intersubjectivity and theory of mind, which is something I've worked on for a long time, so I'm very glad you brought it up in this context.
My pleasure.
Because it's really interesting, exactly what you said, it's a very Western, actually it's a very Western cultural reaction to be able, for me to say, well, what do you think he's feeling? You would have no hesitation, verbally speculating about what might be in somebody else's mind. Now, when I was working in New Guinea, somebody dies, people are crying. And I said to one of my friends, well, how do you think so-and-so is feeling? And they looked at me and they said, I don't know. How do you know what another person thinks or feels? Which stopped me in my tracks. And as I did more and more work, I found that, in fact, nobody ever verbally speculates about what someone else might think or feel, because the mind is private. It's one of the few things in this community that you don't verbally go into. Now, of course, people have their notions. You couldn't operate in everyday life if you didn't think, gee, somebody's reaching for something, you might, know what they're going to do. But it's a very different form, if you want to think about a theory of mind and verbal etiquette, which are tied together. Because to say what might be in somebody else's head is considered gossiping.
Yeah, but
It's
the
not yours.
capacity for the theory of mind is there.
Sure, it's just how it gets manifested through language. And if one of the things we're interested in is language and imagination and the kind of making something public, creating a social reality in a community that doesn't have as its convention that you can verbally speculate what somebody might be thinking or feeling, you have a very different notion of the person, social boundaries. If somebody wants, well, they didn't.
Do they have it, or is it
No,
all
they didn't do that.
mythological?
They
Is it
didn't
all
do that.
stories?
They didn't have that. But people will quote each other. So if you want to know what is going on, people will always say, so-and-so said, I'm not happy. But you need to provide the source. It's almost like you have a little FedEx tag on everything that's said, so you're never accused of gossiping. You can always trace it back. Well, I heard it from him. And then he said, and he told me, I heard it from so-and-so. When we get into these quotative systems of providing evidence, it's another very different way of thinking about how is reality constituted through language. And there are many different cultural possibilities that do get into these issues of evidence, responsibility, theory of mind. One of the big problems people had in translating Mark is that Jesus has the capacity to, and is quoted as knowing what is in the minds of the scribes. This could not be translated. People couldn't figure out how could anyone be able to say what others think or feel. And for 20 years, they had trouble trying to figure out, well, did Jesus hear it? Were they saying it softly? How could Jesus actually do this? Because otherwise he would be a gossiper, which would be really bad, the worst thing you could be. So I think when we begin to open up some of these ideas, like theory of mind, to some of the cultural perspectives, and it's a pretty well documented phenomenon now in many Pacific societies, that you don't verbally speculate.
So what about behavior? In other words, does the behavior reveal that they have a sense of theory of mind, or does the behavior also reveal?
Of course it has to.
Yeah.
But you don't.
It doesn't have to be a unitary thing.
Right.
It could be levels of it.
Right.
David Olson, your colleague at
Yeah.
U of
Yes.
T, believes that theory of mind doesn't fully develop without literacy. Yeah.
David Olson and I have had many hot discussions about this topic.
He thinks you need literacy to have a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to
But
pry
here's-
into his mind, but did you hear him say this?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good.
The world on paper?
I have to
world on
make a
paper.
point about your point about pointing. And the point
It's
is...
not polite.
The point is, chimps do not point. There's a fellow named Michael Tomasello who I met in Leipzig, and he has a laboratory there, which is the Leipzig Zoo, and he studied primates. He's a primatologist, and he said that, this is not speculation, he actually said this, that chimps do not point, but human babies point. And the human babies and young children always want to be helpful. They always want to share. They always want to help. And we are the only species that has this property. And that's why we developed language.
Well, this is one of the things I was going to ask. A couple of things. One, in terms of the return of the repressed, I'm not sure if I would buy that, because what would be more the psychoanalytic explanation of what's happening with, let's say, instant messaging is that you are using concrete instead of the more abstract. So if you say for you, that you are using a more concrete way of writing or showing rather than a more abstract one, which would be more, in psychoanalytic terms, a regression. A regression to a point where you can't really tell the difference, or a regression to what we call in psychoanalysis more towards, though not fully, primary process thinking, which is really thinking in images. That is, they are thing representations, but they're not yet word representations. But that's a developmental achievement in each individual, that during development you develop the capacity to be able to use words and then learn, speak a language, and then write a language. Now, the same thing must have happened in terms of evolution, that it's not just because accountants were pushing these coins into whatever it was, into the mud, but there was an evolutionary progression that allowed to take the step from those coins into writing. And that's a brain development
Are you talking
problem.
about cultural evolution, or are you talking about biological?
Biological.
Well, then the time period for this biological evolution would have been 100 years. And we don't evolve biologically within 100 years. Cultural evolution far outstrips any kind of biological
How would
evolution.
you know it would be 100 years? Because the biological evolution is gradual until it becomes visible. You're only reading it when it's visible.
Because we have concrete information that the first clay envelopes containing tokens come from 3300 BC, and that by 3100 BC they've now pressing the tokens into the mud, as you call it, into the clay. And all of a sudden they realize that once they've, well, actually what happens is a two-step process. First, they take the tokens and put them in a opaque envelope made out of clay. Next step is somebody says, hey, instead of breaking the envelope open to see what tokens are inside of it, let's press the tokens on the outside of the envelope, then we'll know what's inside. But they still put the tokens inside. It took about 100 or 200 years for someone to say, hey, if we know what's on the inside, why bother putting the tokens on the inside? Just press them on the clay. And this development happened over a couple of hundred years, which is not a time frame for a biological evolution. Would you say that, but look, instant messaging, is that evidence of biological evolution? Is the internet biological evolution?
We know who has a theory.
that doesn't-
Julian Jaynes has a theory of a recent biological evolution about, around the time of antiquity. And his argument, there's absolutely no evidence for this, but it's a brilliant kind of speculation, is that people did not have thought as we know it before that time. And when people, and he actually argues that it has to do with the left and right brain and breakdown, that there actually was a physical evolution that went on. But the argument is that when people first started having thoughts, they didn't know what they were. It's like suddenly you hear a voice, and it's like, where's that coming from? So they assumed it was coming from the outside and from a supernatural source. I think you can see just as pretty much until Freud, people thought dreams came from the outside, from supernatural sources. So it's a kind of an awakening that, among others, Walter Ong has argued that this is better explained by literacy. That it's real, but I mean, it's an interesting possibility nonetheless, that people didn't actually have an inner monologue going on very much. And on the occasions that it happened, they attribute it to outside sources like spirits, gods, until literacy comes along and you take your thoughts, you take what's in your head, and you can put them outside of yourself for the first time and look at it. And like Narcissus, you become engaged in a process of reflection and, actually fall in love with, wow, I had these ideas. And it really is, the reflection is The beginning.
That relates very much to.
Could you please go to the microphone, because we're recording all this.
So you're saying, Lance, that all writers are in love with themselves?
I think writing is narcissism, yes.
That
No question
relates
about
very
I
much
agree.
to-
I admit it. Go
that
ahead.
relates
But
very much-
unselfish inwardness. That's,
That relates very much to something that I've been thinking about during a lot of this discussion that this gentleman also articulated a little bit. I work as a jazz musician, and I'm accustomed to music, thinking of music as a language, as an actual discussion going on in my profession. And one of the things that I saw when I looked at this title and decided to come to this lecture today is I thought, literacy and imagination. One of the things that sprang to my mind almost immediately was visual. And you made a reference to cave paintings.
Yes.
What makes that not what makes that not literary? You said literary, devices
these guys said
evolved
that.
later.
No, I'm the one that said imagery is
Okay.
part of literacy.
Okay,
Remember the
because
tie-
I
tie
would
bit?
think
Remember the tie?
I actually don't consider that a relevant example to what I'm discussing.
You're a
sorry.
tough customer.
When I think of cave paintings, I think of an effort to express a thought and an idea and to communicate something. And this gentleman, I don't know, I'm forgetting who said what, but there was like an order. You're talking about the clay things and to keep track of things like that. To me, just a visual imprint of a thought is the initial way that we began to communicate. And where do you draw the line between what is literate and what is imagery? I mean, to me, I was always thinking those first drawings that anyone's ever discovered, that human beings ever made in caves, that was the first form of literacy to the way I understand what literacy is. Now, he's saying no. Now, this is what interests me.
He didn't
because
say
where-
no, he just shook his head.
Well, because to me, it's very interesting to know where that line is.
Actually,
That's all.
you pinpoint it, okay?
Yeah.
If the picture, the image represents a thought, all right, writing does not. Writing is a secondary symbol system used to represent speech.
Sounds.
It's at that point...
That's Bloomfield.
Okay, so
That's the-
distinction. Okay.
but it's
Simple.
art, and art lurks around and over this conversation. What is this human impulse to reproduce something that isn't the actual thing? And I
To
think that
dislocate it in time and
that's right.
space.
That's right.
So it can be recalled. It can be revoiced.
Memory.
Just before you make your remark, I just want to say something to our jazz friend. Let me blow it out to you, baby. All right. Imagination has in it image and visualization, and therefore the line does not exist. The boundary. I don't see the boundary. Over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, in reference to that, just one other, is the singing Neanderthal. I would recommend taking a look
yeah.
at that and the idea that a music system is an expression of emotion, that has a separate line of development from the content line of development, and is also communicative and is the first one. That is the first way of communicating. But I know that takes us someplace else. Oh,
The written part was what I was...
yeah.
The visual.
Oh, introduce
Okay,
yourself.
I'm Sue Shapiro,
Yes,
and I wanted to hear more from Bambi about the relationship between literacy and fundamental and learning it through the Bible, because New Guinea's the only place, I travel a lot, it's the only place I went running from, sort of waving my American Express card saying, "Get me out of here." And when people have asked about it, there were two things that I would always point to. One was that I only saw one person reading, the whole time I was there. And the other was when I heard about somebody's pig who ate up somebody's sweet potatoes, and then they didn't return, and all of that, and then they killed the guy. And I thought, where's the Talmud? And where's the Ten Commandments? And I actually ran away and got to Cochin just in time to get to shul and hear the part of the Torah where they're reading the Ten Commandments. But I thought, I'm being drawn to missionaries in the airport. It's time to get away from this place. But so I'm curious about how those two things get linked and what happens then to people's way of thinking when they're learning to read and also learning this Western system.
Well, I'll see if I can answer any part of that. Missionization is about transforming people, making them into something different. And so when I think about missionization, I think about this the goal is to totally transform, to remake something different.
Right, which is why I normally hate them and run from them.
I understand your position. And one of the reasons I did not choose to study fundamentalist Christians, it was something that I couldn't help but study. I'm a linguistic anthropologist, but what I saw happening in a community that I had spent a lot of time in before missionaries came was this new form of authority that was being imposed into a community where people were told everything that they did was bad and they would burn in hell, and that they had to do all of these new things. Literacy was part of the package. Literacy was part of the practices that people had to acquire if they wanted to become different kinds of persons. So there were a lot of language transformations that go into this process, and it was very complicated. But if you think about if we just go back to the imagination, what it really was about was people having to try to reimagine themselves as other kinds of people. It's very hard for people to do this in a situation where there's no other show in town except what the missionaries are doing. And so you have to see, I think of it as a package. It's about the rejection of one's past, the rejection of all those other practices, which, while they may have looked a little discombobulated, the traditional systems of exchange and reciprocity are really coherent and they really work. They do occasionally involve murder, but we do that too. But when you really think about the idea more broadly is there are different systems of belief about how you be a person. It's just, one group is trying to make some group act like them.
But was there no form of written word?
No, there's a not literate. The society, nowhere in New Guinea was there any indigenous literacy. In many parts of the world, there was no indigenous literacy. People did fine. They did fine. They sang, they had incredibly rich aesthetic lives, they had lives with incredible memory paths. They did, it was a very satisfying existence for many reasons.
Until someone's pig ate your sweet potato.
Well, or somebody crashes into your car in New York, right?
Make a little note here. I have a piece coming out about the Ten Commandments in General Semantics Bulletin, and one of the points about the second commandment is very significant. Neil Postman first made this, that it's a prohibition against all images, not just images of God, but images of anything in nature, and why. And it's such a big Megillah. It goes on, not of birds, not of fish, nothing. It really smacks you in the head with it. Plus there's all this other stuff. There's psalms against the idol makers and all that. What's the problem? It's to try to create literacy, and in order to create literacy, you have to get rid of the previous system. You have to sort of repress at this point image thinking and image making in order to establish the literate mindset, repress the concrete in order to pick people up onto an abstract level.
Before your remark, I just want to say there's a connection between literacy and missionization. The Greeks had to have all their cities like Greeks. The Romans had their cities like Romans. Even Moses was converting people, wanted them to be Jews. right? And he did some pretty nasty things. So there's a connection between literacy and getting people to be like yourselves. Yes?
This has to do with the beginning of the very interesting discussion, how the tokens came, and then they were put in an envelope, and then they were pressed, and then somebody said, oh, we don't need this. I was thinking, and then the question was asked, how does this go into imagination? But then there was no follow-up to that. I was thinking, somebody must have dreamt this, because like Einstein dreamt something, and then he put it down, and the guy who discovered the benzene ring in chemistry,
Yes.
put it, like, he saw two snakes. So I'm thinking, and I'm wondering, in literacy and imagination, what part do you think the dream world plays in this?
All right, let's see if we can dream up an answer to that. Anyone
Well,
with a dream?
the idea of the benzene ring, Kekule's dream that led to his resolving the problem is that, one, he was working on the problem. He was working very hard on figuring out the benzene ring. And second of all, he didn't wake up in the morning and have the thought that this dream he had about snakes had all sorts of other symbolic meanings. He took it very concretely, the way they were interconnected, and realized he had resolved the problem. So the dreams did not give the answer. It's just that in that state of mind, he had already resolved the problem that then was represented in the dream in that image.
But in what you're answering, I would say the dream was the linchpin to,
Not necessarily. I have no doubt he would have solved the problem the next day or the day after.
who knows? Anyway, thank you.
Because many people have
I'm
solved.
with you. I think the dreams, you get
Thank
good
you.
ideas by dreaming.
But what's significant is the individuals we're talking
Relationship.
about are all literates. And I would say that when literacy comes in, we repress the unconscious in a way where people without literacy do not have the same barriers in place, and so the unconscious, the oral singer of tales lets the unconscious mind sort of spring forth very freely, and we get oral myth out of that. Literates repress the unconscious, and Walter Ong, Marshall McLuhan, they made the point, the anal stage, and there's like the oral stage in psychoanalysis and oral culture.
In
the
reverse.
literate stage is the anal stage. And that there's something, the anal personality is a very literate type of person, very precise. So, I mean, these things go together. Now that we're in a post-literate electronic era, we're taking the cap off of the unconscious, and that you can see that on the internet. That's where the unconscious sort of goes. Yeah, and God only knows what's going to come out. It's already coming out. It's actually, a little scary when you think about it.
The question then I have for the psychoanalytic team: would Freud be able to do business if the internet existed in his time?
Why not?
Because I'll tell you what. Because there was no repression of the subconscious.
There was a conference at St. Louis University about Walter Ong, and they had a psychoanalyst, and I forget his name, but he was speaking about analysis as being a talking cure. And I asked, could a psychoanalyst deal with a person from an oral culture? And he really didn't have an answer for it. I suspect the answer is no. I suspect that psychoanalysis can only deal with people from a literate mindset, and perhaps post-literate, because we're still carrying that. That's my suspicion, but I don't. Perhaps you haven't dealt with it.
Why.
This sort of leads into my question.
Good.
I'm always a little skeptical about people speculating that other human beings are completely different from them. And I'd like to ask Bambi a question. I found what you said very interesting about the people in Papua New Guinea and the theory of mind. But on the other hand, if you're not supposed to speculate about somebody else's thoughts or feeling because it's gossiping, that's a moral stricture, which suggests that people do gossip. Maybe not to maybe not to outsiders, anthropologists, but among themselves, and it's considered a bad thing to do. And a holy man in the Bible wouldn't do it, but it is done. As all things that we have moral injunctions against are actually done in real life.
That's true.
And that maybe, as far as I understand, very little I know about life in Papua New Guinea, people live together in the same houses, they sleep all entangled. I mean, there has to be some way of providing privacy, as you say, and maybe this moral stricture provides them
Well,
the necessary privacy.
I mean, it's a really good question because it's often kind of shocking when you say, gossip. I mean, we first of all don't even think about that form of verbal speculation as gossip.
Some people do.
But I mean, just even how somebody's feeling, just if you see somebody on the street, I mean, many people feel don't see it as a problem to say, gee, that person must be sad.
Yes, but that may be reflect a different moral system, not a different psychology or philosophy of mind or...
One thing I found in my long-term study of children's socialization is that when small children, because I did a longitudinal study of the language socialization of children in this community, that was my first major study in the 70s, when 2-year-olds would say what somebody was feeling, they were told no.
Yes,
A moral
teaching.
Children were socialized not to verbally speculate. So it was part of a cultural construct of how you behave.
Yes.
So for example, also, if a baby was babbling and a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old would put words to that babbling, which, we do it, if baby's babbling, we often we put words, we make it into an utterance. But when little kids would say, oh, he's saying, and then they would give it words, mothers would say, no, he's going blah, 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 blah. So there was a clear line drawn on interpretation of whether somebody actually said it, because it was all part of, I say, a stance towards a form of responsibility and evidence of what you know. And the case I studied, I taped a very long case that went on for days, where somebody was accused of gossiping. And it was a major issue in the community for days.
And gossip has the same connotation it does in English, as something bad.
No.
Wrong.
No. It means it's not yours to say. It's not necessarily bad. It just means that you don't have the right to report that information. If somebody's feeling happy
Sounds
and
like they were all basic scientists who had to have complete evidence before they drew conclusions.
But these systems do have strong linguistic systems of evidential marking, but it's related to notions of personhood and what is kind of private and what is not. And I think that it really is about personhood.
I'm curious about you as coming from another culture.
They were curious and they observed me as closely as they could, and but they never said to me, "How come you do?" They didn't ask those kinds of epistemological questions that I was. It really struck me because I had worked in language acquisition in white middle-class kids, and parents were always taking those little babbles and making them into rich interpretations. So,
if I could just ask one follow-up question.
You can, but I want to make a remark on your remark, which was that gossip is bad. Gossip is getting a bad rap here, and I want to speak in praise of gossip. Because gossip actually has certain survival characteristics to it. Gossip is a way that you warn your friends about people that could be dangerous to them or get them into trouble. There are people that believe that language began so that through gossip.
Right.
Because it was important to be able to tell people that dude is not someone you want to deal with. So gossip is not always bad. Nothing is either good or bad. It's just a question of the context.
There was also social cohesion. The theory, Robin Dunbar's theory, that as we moved away from picking fleas off of each other the way apes do, gossip took the place of grooming as a means of binding the community together.
It's very controversial.
Could I ask you a follow-up question?
Miss, I think we have to go.
Okay.
Roger, you were next, and then you're next after that.
This lady is...
He was next, and then she...
I'm the moderator, sir. You run the place.
You didn't even introduce
But this lady wanted to comment on her So let's let her do that, and then we go to Roger. Roger's cool with that.
Absolutely fine.
All right.
It's a quickie. Just the use of the word gossip, couldn't it be at the base of that is a respect for the complexity of human mind and experience? We use the word projection. You cannot, or we use the word don't judge in a more sophisticated society, let's say. And they may not understand the basis of it, but you just don't know enough. You just don't, you can't know what's in another person's mind and experience. And even though there is a simpler society, the human mind is just not simple. It's, you know, multi-level and complex. Also, I just want to say a word about the title of this, and about imagination and literacy. One function of literacy is to reinforce, is to create and reinforce some kind of consensus. It is arbitrary. You are really clearing away a lot of the possibility of the richness of mind and experience, but one wants to have some kind of consensus, and it becomes a reality consensus, and also it gets into a pathology if it's brought to its conclusion, into fundamentalism. You know, it starts with absolutism and fundamentalism, and don't you dare mess up my notion of reality or my group's notion of reality, leads to wars. So when you take the Talmud out of the Torah, when you take the multiplicity of expressions out of that which is quite literal, you're really moving into dangerous territory when you don't respect that, the magnitude of, call it imagination, or the richness of mind, human mind and experience. And in New Guinea, what you're saying is gossip, might somehow have a kernel, the seed of that understanding in its the way it's acted out.
Thank you for your question. The answer is yes. Roger.
And, this is a follow-up to Lance's.
Roger, why don't you
suggestion.
introduce yourself? You're a frequent. Roger's a frequent contributor.
He's Roger.
My name is Roger Copeland, and I teach at Oberlin College.
All right.
And
From Ohio?
From Ohio.
Why
Indeed,
did
the
you ever
only
leave
Oberlin
Ohio?
that I know of. But anyway, you, by way of McLuhan and Walter Ong, talked a little bit about the connection between literacy and anal retentiveness. And I wanted to ask if there's a connection to the power we gain over something when we name it, and the extent to which the act of naming often conceals as much as it reveals about the thing, as in Paul Valéry's aphorism that true seeing involves forgetting the name of the thing one sees.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, absolutely, and actually, general semantics gets very much into that. You know, so that Alfred Korzybski, the founder, was known for saying that whatever you say something is, it isn't, right? And so it's whatever we describe. I mean, is the fundamental notion is that the word isn't the thing it represents, and the map is not the territory. So I mean, that's absolutely the case. And we can add to that when we go from speech to writing, we have actually intensified that effect, and the word actually becomes a thing and becomes written in stone, sometimes literally, and becomes that much harder to change, that much more absolute. That's where the interesting effect of electronic writing comes in, because the word suddenly goes from being a physical object to energy, and becomes very fluid, and we actually restore, or I think it is, a kind of return of some facets of orality and scribal culture that didn't exist before. Texts become fluid. That really goes back to your wonderful point about the Talmud and the internet. I mean, it is that the printed book particularly became this discrete, closed, fixed object, but that's not natural. That's only in existence for a few hundred years. The natural condition is for language to be free-flowing, which, of course, in terms of the subject matter, opens us up more freely to imagination.
Roger, permit me a post-Korzybskian interpretation. Words actually create things. So cyberspace gee, thanks to that science fiction writer, we have a way of talking about something that's very real, but is very abstract and virtual.
See, of course, Korzybski would say, you think it's real because you've named it, but actually what you're acting as if you know what it is when you really don't, and you're acting as if it's one discrete thing when it really is a multitude of different experiences, that really all together add up to what we think, or what any one individual thinks, is cyberspace. Each person has their own different set of experiences, events that go on, that when we go to a computer, that go online, and that's why you get all differences of opinion, right? If you go online and read blogs all the time, you're going to come out and say, wow, this is like a whole new level of print, and it's extending that. And if I go online and spend my time on YouTube, I'm going to say, no, this is a new kind of, entirely new environment, a televisual environment. Somebody else who's just listening to podcasts is going to say, oh no, this is a revival of orality and a return. So it's like that blind man and the elephant, really.
The one thing that
go
I was
ahead,
just going to say, the one thing that I think we can't add necessarily now as a component to the conversation, but that for me hangs over it is, what does it mean to produce literature in this age? Because basically we have too much information now to absorb. There was a time where you really could have a canon, and there were things that everyone had to know. And now there are too many things to know. You have the decoded genome, and you have vast literatures that we knew nothing about. And have we, out of all of this, much of this conversation is about how we communicate, but shoring those fragments, against our ruin, or however you want to put it, and making something autonomous and whole is a very complicated challenge now. And whether we've lost our capacity to see that sort of wholeness, or whether we're going to learn to live inside of the brokenness and find our wholeness, we don't know. But talking about the thumb novel isn't going to do it. And I think that it really raises a question. Henry James said about Middlemarch, if this is how we write literature, what's going to happen to history? But you could almost say the reverse. So how will we create literature? How do you have a momentary stay against the confusion when the confusion is sort of what the world we live in? It's all an ADD culture now. And I just think that that's an interesting question. It's harder than having visual representations that are art simply because they are things that are not real and yet fashioned by human hands. And using words to make things is different from using other materials.
Let me interject the long tail. The long tail is the notion that in the internet, you have many different communities. And like the top 100 songs don't sell the most songs on iTunes. It's the long tail of the songs that have small audiences, but there are many of them. So now there are thousands and thousands of authors. That's wonderful. And they have smaller and smaller audiences. So back when you had the Bible and everybody read the Bible, or they read Plato and Aristotle in the Bible, there was only one book, or 2 or 3 books, right? Now we have thousands and thousands of books. Everybody has a choice, and everybody can find something that interests them. I think it's fantastic.
But what I guess I'm saying is...
You're not going to have a bestseller, Jonathan, so get over it.
No. But I mean, what I'm trying to say is, despite the fact that writing. Despite the fact that I'm using the Talmud as a kind of paradigm, when Rashi was writing his commentary, someone else Chrétien de Troyes was writing the Song of Roland, which was part of a large myth of Western literature. It became its own saga, and the Talmudic culture is great, but it's not literature. It's stories are in some sense the molecules of the Talmud. So is commentary. It's a vast book that both is and is not a book. It's a huge companion, but it's not the work of literature that gives voice in certain ways to the culture we live in. I just think, I'm not saying it has an answer. I'm not saying it's finished. I'm just saying to me it's an interesting question. How do you do it?
My reluctant answer is it's gaming.
Go to the microphone.
It's gaming is the new literature. It outsells movies. I mean, this is. I'm not into it. My son is. Halo and Schmalo and all these things. Yeah. Laura Croft. I mean, these are old things now. I can't think of the new ones. Fable is the big. This is the literature that we're we're going into, and that, like Moses, we're going to just look at this from a distance and shake our heads and not enter this
die
land.
in the wilderness.
Yeah.
We have
Go
time
off
for one
to
more question.
Gaming.
Oh,
games.
one more question.
And he's right here.
Yes.
Make it a good one.
Back to our topic of imagination.
I don't know. Is that allowed?
Is that allowed? I was wondering if seeing the cultures, pre-literate cultures, what incredible imagination is reflected by pre-literate cultures, and the fact that in an oral tradition you have wonderful creativity because you're not held down to a written tradition. And so whether you be Tlingit Indians or sub-Saharan Africans or whatever, you have wonderful myths that develop and wonderful creativity because the oral tradition can constantly change and evolve. You can have myths about how the tribe began, whatever. Whereas it seems to me perhaps literacy restricts our creativity in that we now know what our history is. We know that George Washington wasn't a god that flew down with eagles bringing him, and the sun was a baked cookie that rose in the sky.
No, we just learned that Washington used slaves to build the White House.
Yeah.
Change
It's a
things.
different mix, though.
But do we have more creativity where we're talking about the idea before we wrote symbols to represent things, where we just had our minds thinking creatively in imagery? Is that more creative than restricting ourselves to little scribbles that then are images that represent thoughts? So it's just a thought for us.
Is during the oral phase kids more creative than during the anal phase?
But it's not an either. Well, it's not a quantitative more or less. It's just different. And in orality, you're stuck with the meter of the culture and the tradition of the culture, and people sing the same songs over and over in endless variation. Literacy breaks free of tradition and opens up to novelty. But creates very fixed texts, in the process. So each new stage, and you can think of it evolving consciousness, imagination and creativity evolve along with it.
Thank you.
I hear people rustling. What I'm going to do to end this session is give everybody the last shot. McLuhan said the last shot is always the most important thing that people have to say. Jonathan, what's your last shot on what we talked about today?
I don't know.
Bullseye! Next shot.
Come back to me, or not. Go ahead, give it a last shot.
We're born into cultures, and it's part of what we have invented as human beings. And these are systems of beliefs, understandings, conventions, but also all cultures are able to change, and that seems to be what we do. And it's also the fact that every generation and every community wants to mark itself as different. And one of the things that's going on with the creation of these new literacy forms is it's part of the identity making of specific communities. So
I will have a last shot.
Yeah, okay. Lance?
Cultures change and cultures also die. Whether we're committing suicide or not remains to be seen. We don't know. I mean, we're introducing all this new things over and over as the years go by. We have no idea what that changes and what those changes are going to result in a kind of butterfly effect. We don't know. And one thing we do know, oral cultures existed for tens of thousands of years. Literacy's been around for a few thousand years. What we're doing is momentary. That's what we know.
I'm going to give Walt Whitman the last shot. I typed out this line before I came. I don't know why, but now I do. It's just 2 sentences. Not the book needs so much to be the complete thing, but the reader of the book does. That were to make a nation of supple and athletic minds, well-trained, intuitive, used to depend on themselves, and not on a few coteries of writers. From Democratic Biscuits.
Ed, do you have a last word? No. Do you? I have a last word. I want to thank everybody. It's been a wonderful time, and this proves that not everything that's interesting is written down. This is a great conversation.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.